Since around 2016 or so, I have run into several Christian videos, articles, or individuals that have referred to Trump as a type of Cyrus, the great Persian emperor. To be quite frank, I wasn't sure what to make of that comparison at the time, but the collective chorus of voices that I kept hearing and insisted that Trump was like Cyrus kept growing and growing. Fellow Christian believers and preachers talked about this. People I know and like talked about this. Yet, unlike many of these sincere believers in the Trump-Cyrus comparison, I was and still am skeptical of that comparison. To be honest, even if any other politician from whatever party, liberal or conservative, anywhere in the world had been compared to Cyrus, I would have still been skeptical. But for whatever reason, Trump was the one compared to Cyrus, so even though I'm not a big fan of politics, even though I have obviously spent some time on it and talked about the challenges of mixing religion and politics, I will be talking about a few contrasts between Trump and Cyrus, at least the way I see it. Number one, be careful when making comparisons. To begin with, my skepticism has absolutely nothing to do with the integrity of the people who believed this and may still believe. I suppose that my skepticism came and still comes from my own naturally skeptical nature and the idea that comparing two different people is problematic in and of itself. For example, I sometimes hear people compare young singers on talent shows like American Idol to pop singing legends like Whitney Houston. And as soon as I hear of the comparison, I can't help but be tempted to look for elements of Whitney Houston in that singer. And quite often, I don't see the similarity. It's not that the young talent is not good enough or even amazing. Quite often they are. It's that the comparison unfairly takes the focus off of their young talents and unique strengths and effectively makes us compare those young singers with the established pop star like Whitney Houston. Those young talents may one day be famous, but at the same time, I also know that they will never be a Whitney Houston or a Ray Charles or a Freddie Mercury or anyone else. If they become famous, it may be because they attempted to be the best version of themselves, not somebody else. After all, everyone is unique and their own person. Comparisons ultimately are not fair to anybody involved in the comparison. Let us also take into account what the Bible says about comparisons. 2 Corinthians 10 verse 12 says, "Not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding." Elsewhere in the New Testament, Galatians 6 verse 4 also says, "But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor." So, as you can see, I was already skeptical, but I was willing to learn a little bit more about the great Cyrus, who I already knew was mentioned in the Bible. As I've already said, many fellow Christians have believed that Trump is like Cyrus. However, to be fair to these fellow Christians, it is not just Christians that have drawn a comparison between Trump and Cyrus. Similar comparisons have been drawn by some in Israel too, including the Israeli Mikdash Educational Center, which actually announced in 2018 that it would mint a temple coin that featured Trump alongside Cyrus. As the ABC News article shown here also notes, the organization said in a statement, President Trump is starting a prophetic process by moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. Just like King Cyrus 2,500 years ago said, he charged me to build a house in Jerusalem. Here again, President Trump is building a house in Jerusalem. Now, as a Christian, I love Israel, admire it, pray for it, and hope it continues to flourish and do well. I am grateful that the country of Israel is a strong and vital democracy in the Middle East. However, despite my admiration, I do not feel obligated to agree with everything that its government or its citizens do. To be frank, even Israeli citizens don't always agree with each other or their government. That is to be expected, though, and is in fact just par for the course in a normal democracy. All that aside, I do have to thank all these comparisons of Trump and Cyrus for one thing, and that is this. The little reading on Cyrus that I have done so far has shown me how greatly admired and respected Cyrus was in the ancient world. So much so, in fact, that he became a role model for future leaders. But this is not primarily about Cyrus. It is more about my thoughts about the comparison, and specifically more about the contrast between Trump and Cyrus. A word of caution before I continue. This is not an exhaustive or a detailed listing of differences. With that, let's continue. Number 2. Founder versus inheritor. Cyrus founded the Achaemenid Empire, which is also referred to as the First Persian Empire. On the other hand, Donald Trump, at the time of this writing, is just the 45th president in a republic that has already been in existence for more than a couple of centuries. Number 3. Expanding empire versus deeply divided country. The empire that Cyrus founded, that is the Achaemenid Empire, continued to expand long after Cyrus' death. However, during Trump's tenure as President of the United States, many within this deeply divided, polarized United States and outside it have openly wondered about whether the United States was in decline or if it would even survive. Number 4. Place in history. Cyrus held a place in the minds of the Persian people similar to that of Romulus and Remus in Rome, or Moses for the Israelites, according to this Encyclopedia Britannica article. However, while a certain and vocal minority within the United States have clearly thought highly about Trump, it's not hard to see that the 45th US president is a highly divisive figure that is, at least arguably, not perceived the same way by a majority of the American population. Unlike Xenophon, the ancient Greek philosopher, soldier, and historian who presented an idealized version of Cyrus the Great, many historians today feel otherwise about President Trump. As this article in the Legislative Gazette notes, Donald Trump enters the survey as the 42nd rated president, and he joins Andrew Johnson, James Buchanan, Warren Harding, and Franklin Pierce in the bottom 5 of the lowest rated presidents. I know that's probably hard for some to hear, and to be fair to Trump and his supporters, history is still being written about Trump, and the final verdict is not in yet. Certainly, I do not know what the final verdict on Trump is going to be, of course, whether it will be one of praise, condemnation, or a little bit of both. Number 5, loving his people versus himself. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that there are many people that love Trump. That love or adoration is obvious. I see it on TV, I see it on YouTube, and I see it in real life. But whether a handful, minority, or a majority loves the leader is not the concern of this point here. Rather, this point is more about the leader loving the people. One of the things that struck me as quite remarkable about Cyrus, as I read about him, is his apparent compassion for the people he governed or conquered. He honored his subjects and cared for them as if they were his own children, Xenophon wrote, and they, on their part, revered Cyrus as a father. Trump, on the other hand, has, according to a study, and other people familiar with him, such as his niece, been often accused of narcissism. Narcissism, in case you are not already aware of it, is a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others. But behind this mask of extreme confidence lies a fragile self-esteem that's vulnerable to the slightest criticism. For what it's worth, I suppose everyone in the world has some issue or the other to deal with, and it could be that narcissism is Trump's challenge. But again, it's worth noting that Cyrus is recorded as having honored and cared for his subjects. Number 6, Bible verses about Cyrus. The Bible verse 1 Corinthians 15 verse 52 has been sometimes used to refer to Trump, but quite honestly, that link is still not clear to me. At best, if it is prophetic about Donald Trump, the word Trump is used cryptically like an analogy. At worst, the suggestion that the word Trump here refers to Donald Trump is a complete misunderstanding and misapplication of the verse, whose context appears to be an event that could sometimes be interpreted as the rapture or even the second coming of Christ. On the other hand, the Bible is not cryptic when it provides numerous references to Cyrus, such as Ezra 1 verse 1, Ezra 4 verse 3, 2 Chronicles 36 verse 23, and Isaiah 45 verse 1, where Cyrus is referred to as God's anointed. Number 7, support for Israel. President Trump clearly won the support of many evangelical Christians and Israelis when he announced that the U.S. would move the capital of Israel to Jerusalem. However, while this is a nice, symbolic move that sends an important and strong message of support to Israel, in my mind, maybe not to others, to be fair, but in my mind, it is also qualitatively different from what Cyrus did, which was to free Jews from exile in Babylon in 538 BC, to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their temple and spiritual homeland. Let's also keep in mind that Harry Truman, a Democrat, mind you, recognized Israel and was arguably an instrument of God too in helping to recreate the state of Israel after many centuries and after the horrific Holocaust of World War II when millions of Jews died. In fact, Truman is reported to have said, "I am Cyrus, I am Cyrus." Furthermore, British Lord James Balfour, he of the Balfour Declaration, which announced public British support for a national home for the Jewish people, has also been compared to Cyrus. One could argue that Truman and Balfour were more Cyrus-like in their actual support for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland. This is not to take away from the symbolic strength of the support that Trump provided with his public recognition of Jerusalem. But it's still hard, for me anyway, to see how this is qualitatively on the same level as what Cyrus, Truman, or Balfour did. Again, this declaration by Trump clearly means a lot to many Israelis and Christians nowadays, and I'm not taking away from that feeling. But it's hard to process how this is on the same level as the actions of Cyrus or even Balfour and Truman. As a side note, it is interesting how multiple politicians across history have been compared to Cyrus, and that is instructive in one way. There are clearly qualities in Cyrus such as compassion and love for the governed subjects that many politicians and leaders would do well to learn from. Regardless, I suspect that we can continue to delve more deeply into this. But suffice to say, Trump, to me at least, does not emerge as a Cyrus-type figure, to me anyway. Donald Trump and Cyrus the Great are, of course, two very different people, even if there is some similarity between the two of them. But clearly, regardless, Trump inspires a lot of passions. Certainly to a lot of Christians and some Israeli people, like Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time of this writing, he still remains a Cyrus-like figure. I think at the end of the day, Trump should be considered for his own unique contributions to the United States and the world, good or bad. Trump, again, to be really fair to him, is not like anyone else in American history either. He, like everyone else, is unique, and he's no Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, or even George H.W. Bush. He is, quite simply, Donald Trump. When all is said and done, and history is written for this time period, good and bad, Trump is going to be judged for who he is and what he did, not how he compared to an ancient Achaemenid ruler by the name of Cyrus.